Yes, the dulcet tones of Windows 95. It's like shoving warm butter into your ears, you know what I mean? Or is that just me? And it's not just nostalgia speaking, Windows 95 was genuinely a huge milestone in the world of home computing. There's a reason so many people have fond memories of it. It was basically the first OS that mere mortals could actually use and afford. Plus, just look at all these attractive people using it. This could be you! Coupled with a lot of technological advancements occurring at the same time, Windows 95 stood at the forefront of a very exciting time for personal computers, and solidified the Windows-dominated world that we live in today. Honestly, why did we ever upgrade from Windows 95? I can still browse the internet, check my emails, and write Word documents. What more do you need? And it doesn't spy on me either. You know what? Reject modernity, embrace 30-year-old versions of Windows. That's why. Yeah, it might have been the most usable mainstream OS of its day, but that's not saying much. Windows 95, especially in retrospect, was, there's no other word for it, clunky. McClunky. Even Microsoft was aware of this to an extent. At the exact same time they were developing Windows 95, they were also developing from scratch a much more modern OS called NT. An OS with none of the foibles that come from being based on something originally called Quick and Dirty Operating System. But NT was far too resource hungry for the average home computer at the time, and like it or not, its lack of full DOS compatibility would have been a significant problem for a lot of regular computer users. We did eventually get the benefits of NT at home in the form of Windows XP. We just needed a stopgap while the rest of the world caught up. So if Windows 95 wasn't even the greatest operating system at the time, why are we still talking about it? Well, clearly I don't have much else going on. Us nerds just enjoy reliving computer history, no matter how primitive it all used to be. Normal people might like talking about ancient Rome, but this was our assassination of Julius Caesar. And the one thing we like even more than that is running new stuff on old stuff. Ever see Super Mario 64 on Windows 98? Or a newish version of Firefox on Windows 2000? It may not have a lot of practical use, but man is it satisfying seeing these old dogs do new tricks. So what happens when you're in the situation, which I'm sure a lot of us have been, where you need to write a new app for Windows 95? What are even your options?
Alright team, by which I mean one guy. So I've gone over the new project, but the client has made a special request. They want it to run on Windows 95. Yay. So what are our options? Well, it's Windows, right? Surely we can just use the Windows API. Oh, the Windows API? I think it's a mess. Haven't you ever seen how much code it takes just to make a window that does absolutely nothing? Come on, you really hate yourself that much? Maybe not that much. What about that Microsoft Application Framework, MFC? Yeah, maybe. What was the last version of Support 95? Like 4.2? Something like that. It's pretty old.
The only official way to make the UI is going to be this clunky old IDE that barely even runs on modern Windows.
Can't we use anything more modern? More modern? I guess that rules out Delphi too. Delphi? What do you think we're all going to put up with Object Pascal for the next 20 years? Come on.
Use your head, idiot.
Okay, well, how about that newfangled one, WX widgets? Oh God, don't get me started. WX widgets? The one that says it works on 95 but actually just doesn't? Besides, haven't you seen all the stuff moving away from WX widgets towards Qt? Cute. Yeah, you know, cute. Oh, you mean Qt. No? Pretty sure it's pronounced cute. Well, I'm not calling it that. Oh, but you're okay with calling it cutie? That's besides the point.
First of all, the last version of Qt to support 95 was Qt3, which is already several versions behind. Secondly, you'll never be able to find a copy of the builds anywhere. Apparently their Windows builds were only part of their commercial tier and they've never been republished, so as far as I can tell, they've effectively become lost media. Sure, we can compile it ourselves with the help of patches from some guy on SourceForge, but even then, on Windows 95, it only barely actually works. The text is all screwed up, Windows can't be resized or maximized, which especially sucks when one opens looking like this, and there's no one to report these issues to because no one's maintained this stuff in about 20 years.
All right, you made your point. Qt would be a pain in the ass.
Qt.
Whatever, all right? Do we have anything else? 23-year-old version of Java? So let me get this straight. We've got like 6 options and all of them suck. Yeah. No wonder everything's a fucking website nowadays.
There might be a better way. Maybe. In the early 2000s, Microsoft introduced .NET, which, confusingly enough, has almost nothing to do with the internet. Nor does it have anything to do with cars like this commercial suggests. But to be fair, even I found it challenging to know how to visually represent .NET. It's not like it has a UI, and there are only so many times you can show the same logo. So to solve that, I'm just going to show pictures of this guy instead. What .NET really was a response to Java, which had gained a lot of traction for being both easier to write than C or C++ and completely platform independent. Write once, run anywhere was Java's slogan, and it didn't take long for the idea to catch on. Microsoft responded by making their own easier version of C++ called C#, and they too made a whole platform-independent, write once, run anywhere infrastructure that they then only released on Windows. Since then though, Microsoft has become a little less, well, evil, and today .NET is available on more or less everything. Its primary language, C#, frequently ranks in the top 5 most popular languages, and it's become essentially the de facto way to write modern Windows apps. Well, it all sounds great, doesn't it? If only we could get this on Windows 9X. Well, actually, you can. Visual Studio, even today, still supports writing apps for .NET 2, and .NET 2 supports everything from Windows 11 all the way down to 98 2nd edition. Yeah, you can actually write 98 apps with the latest Visual Studio. But what about Windows 95? What about the king that ushered in the Windows revolution? Well, no. Even .NET's earliest versions never supported 95. Well, why not? Is 95 really that much more primitive than 98 and NT4? I mean, they all look and feel pretty much the same. What is the difference between 98 and 95? Well, for the record, the answer is 3, but other than that, I'm not really sure. 98 definitely feels more refined, and that's mostly how it was marketed, as a tune-up to Windows 95. It did introduce a more stable driver model, and it had built-in support for USB, but how do either of those affect the ability of .NET to run? I know this was 2002 and Windows 95 was 7 years old, but technically, Windows 10 is older than that today. I needed answers, so I went to the one place I knew I could find some. The streets of Los Angeles. Why was .NET not released on Windows 95?
What is .NET again?
You ever get the feeling you're in a bit of a niche? There is actually an answer to this, but it comes in the form of an old Usenet thread from 2001, back when .NET was still in beta. Chris Crabtree tries running .NET on Windows 95, only to find that it says it doesn't support it, despite apparently finding some documentation to the contrary. Rusty Miller, a Microsoft employee, confirms that Windows 95 will not be supported by .NET. When Chris expresses his disappointment, another Microsoft employee, Lance Olson, spawns in to explain. There's a lot of corporate soft speak here about quality assurance, deadlines, and customer satisfaction, but essentially it all boils down to they didn't think it would be worth the effort.
And to an extent, they were probably right. I mean, according to stats collected by W3 Schools, Windows 95 had a whopping 0.8% market share around the time .NET was released. Now, it's probably a little higher for the general population. W3 Schools has a, let's say, technical demographic. But still, if you were Microsoft and you were making something this complex, even I'll admit that it would be hard to see the point.
Still, that doesn't help me or my good friend Chris Crabtree, or anyone else who wants an easier way to write apps for a nearly 30-year-old operating system. That being said, Lance Olson does admit something that we've suspected this whole time. Technically, he says, there are not a ton of differences between Windows 95 and Windows 98, but there certainly are some, and we can't just assume that they won't have an impact.
Now, back in the day, telling Windows 95 users to upgrade was probably not bad advice in general. But today we're not using Windows 95 as a daily driver. At least I hope you aren't.
Our goal today is just being able to run new stuff on old stuff, and from that perspective, getting a whole new app framework on 95 makes a lot of sense. Not only would it make it easier to write new stuff, it would theoretically backport a ton of existing stuff too. According to GitHub, at least a few thousand repositories using this version of .NET. Microsoft may not have been willing to smooth over the gaps between 98 and 95, but they also admit that there aren't that many gaps to begin with, so you know what?
Fine. I'll do it myself.
So I finally decided to plunge in and give it a shot. I mean, how hard could it be? So, what's the deal with backporting? Well, like a lot of things, it's actually pretty simple, at least in theory. If you're writing a program, you may wish to use a fancy, newfangled function from the Windows API. Let's say something introduced first in Windows 10. Backporting is essentially just not doing that, finding ways to achieve the same result, or something close enough, using only older system calls. It's kind of like Windows is your office janitor, you know? And backporting is like saying to him, no thanks, I'll clean the toilets. You start to get a feel for why companies don't do this very often. Imagine trying to explain to your boss, yes sir, I could have had this done within budget and on schedule, but I chose to accept less help. Why? I really wanted to see it run on Windows ME. Alright, so .NET is going to expect certain help from the operating system that Windows 95 is not going to be able to provide. So all we have to do to get it running is find other ways to do what .NET wants. Now, it's one thing to rewrite code when you have code to rewrite, but how are we going to do this with something that's closed source? Well, welcome to part 1 of decompiling .NET. Okay, no, I'm kidding. We can actually do this without touching .NET's code at all. You see, applications communicate with Windows through an array of DLL files, and there are many ways to shove our own DLL in between, with which we can do just about anything. Intercept, modify, or even replace calls entirely, or add those missing calls that the original program expects. Is that a good way to write a virus?
Yes, it is!
Something you might be thinking is this sounds a lot like Kernel X, a compatibility layer that allows apps for Windows XP and 2000 to run on 98 and ME. It's really cool and does work for a lot of things, but not for Windows 95, so we're on our own here. Not the first time an X has left me on my own, am I right, ladies? Yeah. Now, thankfully I'm not trying to write something as all-encompassing as that. Technically, I'm only focusing on one app that runs a bunch of other apps, so that means I only have to worry about what it uses explicitly. Speaking of .NET, how do we actually get it installed on this bad boy? Obviously, it won't be as simple as just running the setup. In fact, even the installer complains about missing Windows APIs. Damn. And honestly, I wasn't all that invested in running the installer. Chances are, with the amount of modifications I'll have to make to .NET, it'll probably be worth just making a new installer that makes those modifications automatically. So what's the main thing an installer does? Well, it puts files on the hard drive, and thankfully there are a lot of easy ways to extract files from Windows installers. So I just threw the files into the right places on Windows 95 and tried it out to see what would happen. Exactly what we would expect. If an app has a hard dependency on a function Windows can't resolve, it'll refuse to even start it, and weirdly complain about a device not functioning for some reason. But this is where we come in. Using a tool called dumpbin, we can list everything it needs, so now we just have to grind through adding whatever's missing on 95. The dump bin? What is this, my house? This will cover most of it, but not all of it. There are ways to call system functions that fail much more silently. Case in point, one DLL wouldn't throw any error message at all. Instead, .NET would attempt to reload it infinitely, overflow the stack, corrupt the memory, and crash the entire computer. Cool. For the record, that wouldn't actually have been possible on NT or any modern OS for that matter. Only 9X allows a single app to corrupt the entire system's memory, one of the many reasons why we don't use 9X anymore. But really, that's all this was, making fake system DLLs for .NET to talk to, passing through the calls that did exist on 95, and adding the ones that didn't, which was really only about 20 or so, and honestly, I'm pretty sure most of these never even get called. Now, how can an app have hard dependencies that it doesn't even use? Well, if you compile something with Visual Studio, by default it links a few standard libraries into your app too. This means it'll inherit all of the dependencies of those libraries, even if you never actually use any of that stuff. That's why even a simple Hello World app built with the latest Visual Studio won't run on Windows 95. You have to disable any default libraries and only add what you need. Again, assuming you only use stuff that is on 95. So I have to admit, if I never saw a function actually get used, I just left it blank because it didn't matter. For the ones that did get used, they were actually really straightforward. I thought I was going to have to steal code from Wine for these, but honestly it was all pretty obvious what each function needed to do, just from the name or description. There were things that realistically couldn't be implemented on Windows 95, they just had no relevance or support at the OS level, but for those I could get away with just faking the results without causing any adverse effects. Eventually I'd worked through all of these system calls and added some registry entries it asked for, and for a lot of apps that would have probably been sufficient, but not here. In fact, now when I'd open an app I'd get nothing. Well, at least it's not an error message? Progress? Well, I got my DLLs to produce some logs so I could see not only if and when it was calling my hacked together code, but also if they, or any other system calls for that matter, were failing. And I soon found one that was, though it wasn't actually one of mine. Yeah, so just because a function exists in Windows 95 doesn't mean that it works the same way as it did later on. It's kind of like puberty, you know, old stuff has new functionality. Well, anyway, that's the end of my set. Goodbye, everyone.
Seriously? So I guess I don't have a career as a stand-up comedian. It's okay, I'll go console myself with that new movie. It's pretty therapeutic. Besides, at least I went on now. Yeah, the guy from Seinfeld's going up next.
The computer, a brilliant tool for anything from equations to communications. An electronic tool like never seen before. Something so powerful it can even work with letters and words. Watch what happens as Clive here pushes a key on the keyboard. As you can see, that very same letter appears on the screen like magic. But the computer does not speak a language like you or me. The computer speaks in numbers. In order to produce human-readable words, the computer needs a way to relate those numbers to letters and vice versa. This is called an encoding. For decades, different people speaking different languages would use distinct and largely incompatible encodings. This was fine when communicating only with people who spoke the same language, but our world is becoming more interconnected as we speak, and when documents are traded between these incompatible encodings, all havoc breaks loose. These concerns led to the formation of the Unicode Consortium in 1991, with the goal to create a global encoding that could represent every language in the world. It is thanks to Unicode that today Japanese hentai can be seamlessly viewed by computer users in America. But it didn't get that way overnight. Early versions of Unicode required existing software to make significant changes in order to adopt it. Nevertheless, it was still considered so valuable, Microsoft had Unicode in their Windows operating system by 1993. But this early adoption came at a price. Windows would have to divide its entire API into Unicode and non-Unicode variants in order to keep older applications running at all. In addition, certain versions of Windows continued to not support Unicode for the next decade, requiring many applications to have to account for both scenarios too. The Unicode Consortium eventually released UTF-8, a standard that required minimal changes to existing code, if any. This standard was widely adopted throughout the computer industry, but it was too late for Windows. While Microsoft provided a way to convert to and from UTF-8, it was otherwise stuck continuing to use the old standard, becoming a permanent thorn in the side of developers. It is one of these conversion functions that causes problems with .NET. .NET strangely tries to convert a UTF-8 string to UTF-16, but 95 never supported UTF-8 in any way. However, the string contains no actual Unicode characters, so a simple ASCII conversion more than suffices. It is unclear why this conversion is necessary, but thankfully addressing it was relatively simple. 30 years later, Microsoft finally recommends using UTF-8 over all other standards. But this change will take some time, as much of their infrastructure still relies on the older standard. We can only hope that the world of international communication continues to become more harmonious.
Well, now that we've worked that out, it should just work, right? Yeah, about that.
I'd finally figured out all the DLLs, but was still getting vague, cryptic errors I couldn't trace. By this point, I started testing my work on a clean Windows 98 install too, since .NET should have no problem running there. Yet, I was seeing the same error. Clearly, my installer is missing something, and honestly, that's not hard to believe. I mean, just look at the original installer. Look how much stuff it's doing. Who, what, where, why? I had no idea, and there was no use staring at it and hoping I'd catch everything. I needed to dig into this installer and see exactly what it was doing.